Welcome. So my name is Francisco Eduardo Robles. Today is Friday, September 20th, 2024. This recording is taking place in Getty's Hall at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. I'm here with poet Javier Zamora, whom I have the pleasure of interviewing for the Letras Latinas Oral History Project. So for the purposes of beginning the oral interview, please tell us your full name, the date of your birth, and where you were born.
Javier Zamora. I was born on February 6th in 1990. And I was born in the capital of the state of La Paz, in El Salvador, which is called Zacatecoluca, which means the grassland of the great horned owls.
And where are you living now?
In Tucson, Arizona.
And how long have you been there?
Since October 2020, so about to be 4 years.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you for joining us here.
Mm.
So my first question is, when did you realize that you were a writer? Where does your story begin as a writer?
When I realized it myself, I think was, that's a complicated question. And for me, I think it took getting an MFA or getting that acceptance call that made it real for me. But that's not when I started writing. And that's not when I fell in love with writing. For my own personality, I'm an only child, an immigrant. At the time, I had just gotten TPS. So I was also between being fully undocumented in this country to having a social security number and having this partial, I don't even know what to call this, partial citizenship almost. And all I'm trying to say is that I need validation for my own sake. And it didn't feel real for my own personality and my own work ethic, because I felt like I was trying to prove somebody something in this country, not only to other people, but to myself and to my parents, that this could be a career choice. And so that's when I realized that I had pursued it enough to a point where I was trying to make this thing happen for me.
Yeah. And you might dispute this, but one of the things that I noticed in Solito and Unaccompanied, your two books, is that you have a very keen observational eye. So even as you're remembering what it was like as a child, as Javiercito, you have a very strong sense of observation, of noting things, of noticing people. And I wonder, since that's something that is conveyed in your own writing, do you feel like it's something you developed very young and that maybe made you artistic in some way or made you feel like somehow you were rendering the world?
Well, one, I grew up very poor in wartime. I didn't have running water. I didn't grow up with colored television. It was black and white, and I was an only child. And so for me, play was always going to the garden, going to my grandma's garden. I grew up very rural, from a very small coastal town. Then now it's bigger. But when I wanted to go play, I literally just went outside and climbed mango trees. We had a sweet sop and sour sop trees, and when I was 4, I broke this arm. So that was my entertainment. And I think from that point, when you teach a child to go out and play in nature, I remember even before I knew what a microscope was, I knew how to zone in to, for example, the sweet sop tree and because I was looking for walking sticks, for praying mantises, for, highways of ants. That was my entertainment. Because when you don't have color television, when you don't have screens, this seems more alive than sitting in front of a very grainy, and we had an antenna that sometimes didn't work and you had to kick it. So I think that was my first craft lesson and taught me how to move the lens, move the camera. In Solito, I talk about, one of my most cherished memories of childhood is, sitting in the bed with my aunt or my mom, and my grandpa did, you would call it like a skylight, but it wasn't really a skylight. He had gotten, I don't know how, glass terracotta tiles. So they weren't terracotta, they were like clear. So, and he had built like 8 of them, in which he created like a skylight right above our bed. So I remember viewing through that. And to me, just that little hole in the roof was way better than a screen, and I could like see the stars. And so I don't know.
Yeah, that's actually something you write about quite a bit, and you remember as you're traversing in Solito, you remember laying with your feet against the wall and looking up. So that's something that obviously has stuck with you a lot.
Yeah. Very since childhood.
Yeah. One of the other things that I love that you just said too, and I'm going to skip ahead in my questions and then I'll ask it again, but your observation of the small things is really interesting because in both Unaccompanied, your poetry collection, and in Solito, your memoir, you talk about small things. You talk about ants, little creatures. You talk about Paula, this lizard that you see in the dirt when you're crossing. Can you talk a little bit about that too? Like, why is that something so, like the small things, something that you pay so much attention to?
Well, Paula was a real lizard. And the best way that I could explain that is that after years of therapy, my therapist taught me that, and I didn't know that this is what I was doing, but when you take a child and you throw them in a traumatic experience, that child is going to use whatever he knows up to that age, and he's going to use those tools to cope. So my coping mechanisms, when you threw me into this 3,000-mile journey, my best coping mechanism was nature and how to use my eyes to distract myself from the very harsh life and death realities that I was facing. Another coping mechanism was cartoons, like any child. In that same scene, right before I see Paula, I remember trying to be Goku or Superman. I wanted to fly out of there. And as a child, that is a very real possibility because you still don't know physics and the people don't actually fly. And when that didn't work, I was still stuck in the dirt somewhere in Oaxaca with men pointing guns at me. The first gun that I ever see in my life. When that didn't work, Paula was there. And I think that's why Paula keeps on coming up. Right before I proposed to my wife, there was another lizard that reminded me of Paula. And I remember, this is still a conversation that I have with nature. I was like, send me a sign, nature. And there it was. And that's how I knew we were hiking. That's when I knew when to propose. And so I think for me, nature and coping mechanisms are very intertwined.
Yeah, that reminds you too of the is it candejo that you cadejo, the cadejo that you mentioned over and over again in the book. You bring up this cadejo. I didn't do a count of how many times it comes up.
Yeah,
but it's
probably
also,
a lot.
a lot, and it's actually just this very. It's almost like this sort of way that you can intertwine the spiritual and the natural through this creature, the spiritual creature or the spirit creature.
Well, growing up in El Salvador, I think in any Latin American nation, we are taught a spirituality that's not necessarily of that place. I remember, going to church. I went to a Catholic school. And eventually, once you begin to question things, I felt that wasn't for me. And so once you get to that understanding, there's a hole that hasn't been filled. And I think for me, and that's a transition between like Unaccompanied and Solito, I think the big thing that I don't really talk about is, there's that, my upbringing, but there's also being a survivor of a trauma. And the big question that any survivor has is like, why me? Why did I survive when I was with people that perhaps didn't? And for me, Chele, I don't know what happened to Chele. statistics show that he's probably still in the desert.
Mm.
And then you keep asking this question. And the best answer that I had and that I got is that, us as Latina people, that's just a construction. That's just an idea. And we have to analyze what makes us, who we are. And for me, it is getting easier to say, but it has been very difficult. And the Catholic Church has a lot to do with this, is that to call myself an indigenous person shouldn't feel like how it has felt for me.
Mm-hmm.
And once you begin today, in El Salvador, there is only 200 to 300 native speakers left. We're at risk of losing our Nahuatl Pipi language forever. And so for me, it's very important to understand that and to try my best to rescue any little thing that I know. And I remembered growing up with this idea of the cadejo. It's this dog-like figure. It's not a dog. It's not a coyote. It has hooves that every single human being has to protect them. And how I view that is not necessarily that there was an actual physical thing protecting me, but this is a vessel for my ancestors. And I know for a fact that it was my ancestors that helped me survive.
Yeah. That had reminded me of when you were talking about this. That's right. And so in Solito, you also talk about, I wanted to go back to something you had just said about the sort of embracing indigeneity. You notice as you go through parts of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Mexico in particular, the way that the word Indio is used as an insult. And it's something that's really important, I think, as a you're a 9-year-old in this book. You're registering this conscience, this way that racism is working, the way that colonialism is being sort of internalized. And I found it as a really interesting sub-narrative in here. You're thinking about indigeneity as a sort of like child learning these things. So could you talk a little bit more about this? And you can tie it back to the cadejo, you don't have to, but yeah.
I mean, a child isn't born racist. No child is born racist. These are things, ideas that are imposed on us. Same with patriarchy, sexism, all these isms. When a child is born, who do they have even before they go to school? It's the parents. And so I wanted to, because this has been something that I've fought with my family, this term, to call somebody else Indio or negro, or we don't, in Latin America, at least in El Salvador, we don't say Asian, we say Chino, which is like, even like Chino, there are levels, some of them very obvious racism, and others that are more subtle. And I'm like, where does that come from? And why don't we say anything? And analyzing things, I love my grandpa, I love my mom, I love my dad, but they still say things like these, even after I tell them not to. And a short story, my mom, we fought about how she uses that term. And then even before I did, she wanted to take a DNA test because in her mind, there was going to be a lot of Spain there because this is what we're taught. And she wasn't expecting that she's 12% Black. That was a big shock for my mom. And so in a way, this is not an advertisement for 23andMe, but for my pseudo-racist mom to view that she's actually 65% Native, 12% Black, and the rest, very slim part, white, was a shock. And I have seen a change in how she thinks of this term and how she thinks of who she is, which actually helped me not only, like I know, like my great-grandma, it's like almost like a Marquez novel. I grew up with my great-great-grandma, my grandma's grandma. And it was me who found her dead in her bedroom. And she used to speak some language that I didn't know. Nobody named it. Nobody knew what it was. And now I know is that it was Nahuatl. And so all these things happening at the same time when I'm beginning to have therapy and beginning to really look at this hole that I had inside of me. So
yeah, thank you. It was just I thought it was a very interesting and notable part of the book. Yeah.
But I didn't answer the question of like how, you know, a child learns all these things, and also it's a critique, right? There was this indigenous woman in southern Mexico that I don't know where she was from, but it was her, and I've always, you know, try to ask, why did she turn us in to these authorities who were questioning her citizenship? They didn't believe that she was Mexican. And so what is Mexicanness? What is Salvadoranness? What is Americanness? These are all constructs. These are all ideas. And so that woman, because of capitalism, because of racism, all the isms that a child is not born with, she knew that in order to make herself feel like a Mexican, that she had to turn away the non-Mexicans. And that I just see her being part of this fallacy, this bullshit narrative that all these Central Mexicans who have the power, the lighter skinned Mexicans have the power, she has been raised hearing this over and over, that she's not a complete citizen. And so the only way that she knows to make herself feel better, perhaps for that brief moment, is to show those people who tell her that she's not part of who they are, that in fact I am, and here I'm turning these people over. So I forgive her because she didn't know what she was doing.
Yeah. One of the things that you said earlier too, just maybe a minute ago, it was a perfect segue to my next question, which is about music. Another thing that's really interesting in Solito in particular is the way that you note that you listen to the same music in each country you're in. That the same bands are coming up, the same people are being referenced, there are the same cassettes that the six you all are listening to. But you also note that in the radio, there are these musicians. So there's a way in which you're sort of building this tapestry of connection through the hemisphere. Maybe as a way, maybe this is my interpretation, as a way against the way we separate ourselves in sort of imaginary ways or through nationalistic ways. Somehow there's still this shared pop culture, this shared music. I just found it really notable how often the music that you were listening to came up in the different bands.
Well, how I viewed it, yes. I saw it as a contrast of American pop culture and Latin American pop culture, at least in Central America. You know, the biggest industry for music and television was Mexican-based, Televisa, and like all the records, all the studios that were coming up. And so that was a sphere that we all understood. But as a child, I also wanted to come to the Full House, or wanted to go to the Baywatch Beach, you know? And so, yes, music, I think, is the easiest form to understand what generation you're from. I found myself, even as a undocumented immigrant in this country, as feeling like I didn't belong for all the reasons, but also for the popular music aspect of it. And it wasn't until college that I found other people that liked the same music that I did, who, like, even after I immigrated, whose mom always played Camila when she was cleaning, you know, or who knew who Zoe was, or Control Machete, or even Soda Stereo, you know, who knew who Marco Antonio Solis was. And then you find, you know, these are just key terms. They're like, oh, you know what I know, and you know that song was a theme of this novela that my parents and my grandma watched. And then it's like these conversations that tell us that we belong and that we're not alone and that we're not, I don't know, loners.
There's a moment in Solito when you and Patricia actually start singing a song together. You're watching TV. I think it's in Acapulco.
La Familia Telerin.
Yeah. Right? And that you all are bonding, but that's a moment that it seems like suddenly it clicks. Something clicks. You can be the familia almost.
And I think, like, there's a way to look at moments like that as immigrant community building. because we're already immigrants. We are no longer in El Salvador. We're in Mexico. And even there, had we just stayed there and never made it here, we already understood what it means to not be home and to not have the comfort of hegemony. I don't even know that term. Because all those things are just taken for granted when you're just part of it. And I think that immigrants understand what it's like to not have those things taken for granted. And that's the beginning. It's like, oh, La Familia Telerin, she knows the tune that I know. That was the tune that I went to sleep with. And we're all part of a generation in El Salvador when, I've had people like, I know that tune. Or like Topollillo, like I grew up with Topollillo,
Yeah. Another moment of that community building too is when you all are in the, I don't remember the term for it, but the Catholic sanctuary in Nogales. When you meet the man you call El Miguelense, because he's from San Miguel.
Or El Migueleño.
Yeah. El Migueleño, sorry, El Migueleño. And Chino, Patricia, they're arguing about who's actually being played over the sound system. And he gently corrects them. And he says, it's El Buki's featuring Marco Antonio Solis. But it's a really sweet moment, actually, of brief connection, but intimate connection through this music, again, through pop culture.
Yeah, and I don't know, outside of literature, when I got to this country, it was 1999, and some of the first movies, either good or bad, because I shouldn't have watched this movie so young, it was like the heyday of Mexican film. And, there's Amores Perros, there's like Y Tu Mamá También, and like then it was like The Crime of Padre Amaro. It was less so the last one, but just those two films for me told me that music was important. Because in those two, and there are other films as well, that when they released the film, they created new songs with bands like Café Tacuba, Natalia Lafourcade, Zoé, and it was not only the film that was important, but the soundtrack. And I love those soundtracks. And even before I wanted to be a writer, I knew, or those releases of those two movies in particular showed me that popular culture and that music was very, very, very important. Because I've watched my parents, they love those films. And I was like, I don't know why, but I also gravitate towards those films.
Yeah. No, I like that a lot, especially because I think it does tie both to building connection, but also one of the things that you talked about briefly that I wanted to return to was the sort of supercharged influence that Mexican pop culture has on Latin America. I think it's one of the things that perhaps a lot of people don't realize or don't think about, especially from the US, but the enormous influence that especially the Mexican dialect, Mexican pop music, Mexican TV has on a lot of the world, not just Latin America at this point. And you all talked about in the book learning the accent to be Jaliscientos, right? Tapatíos, that's right. Somebody who's not from Jalisco, I don't know, right? But you're like, what's a tapatío? And or the words like popote, right? The specific words that are needed So the question is here, the idea of Mexicanness is something to embody or inhabit as a dialect as well, but also as a pop culture, is something that I found super interesting here in Solito. Do you feel like it's something that you were explaining to a certain degree to a specific audience? Because I think, again, for a lot of people, it might be surprising to hear about this enormous influence that Mexico has.
Well, we can all use this as metaphor too, right? To what it means to not be the leading immigrant group. In the West Coast, it's very Mexican-centric. In Florida, it's very Cuban-centric. In the East Coast, it's either Puerto Rican or Dominican. And if you're not that, it is very difficult. I've had family members who came older than I was. They were in their 20s, but they came in the 80s in LA, in which now they have forgotten their Salvadoran accent because they needed to lose it in order to get a job, in order to survive. And so Again, immigration as the formation of what it means to be an immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of non-Mexicans who immigrate through Mexico
Mm-hmm.
would definitely understand what it's like to put a mask on in order to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And some of us keep that mask on in the United States in order to survive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, right now, in September of 2024, we're seeing, well, already we've seen a lot of Venezuelans. You know, Venezuelans weren't as a big part anywhere in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're surpassing, you know, I think they're going to surpass us or already have.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Salvadorans surpassed Puerto Ricans in 2017 as the second biggest immigrant group.
Mm-hmm.
And Venezuelans are on their way, Haitians as well. You know, there's a lot of Haitians coming in.
Mm-hmm.
And their story is different, but I can guarantee you that their story as the non-leading immigrant group looks similar. You don't only have to put a mask on to survive against or alongside the white world, but us who are not the leaders have also to put a second mask on in order to survive within the already established immigrant community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that you just made reference to that I wanted to circle back to as well is the bigger visibility, especially within academia, journalism, and elsewhere of Central American studies. You didn't say that explicitly, but one of the things that I think is really interesting is that there's this really powerful rise of awareness of talking about writers from Central America. And you feature as one of these writers often within the conversation. So for you, what does it mean that there's a greater awareness of and way more discussion of the nuances, the particularities of Central America?
It's great.
Mm-hmm.
I wish that I had that as a student. When I was an undergrad, I think only CSUN, Northridge, had a Central American Studies department, which is the first. And I would also caution for us, because in a lot of these programs, it's very Salvadoran centric because we have been here. And now we run a risk of replicating what was done to us by Chicano studies departments. So let's not do that. Let's genuinely open the discussion and possibilities. Because, for example, to use as a metaphor, you know, memoirs studies. This is not the first memoir written by an immigrant. You know, Reina Grandes. I wouldn't be here without Reina Grande. She was very important. She's Mexican. That was bound to happen. My story, written by a Salvadoran, was bound to happen. There's Roy Guzman, who is Catracho, you know, already has a poetry. If it's not his memoir, there's a memoir coming from Catracho. There's another one by a Nicaragüense. There's soon to be one by a Venezuelan. It is not here, but it will be. So in these departments, let's have a symbolic chair there for if they don't already exist or if these works don't exist yet, they will. And let's make that happen instead of being like, oh, we're Salvadoran and this is like the example for everything. I took Latin American history. That's like my undergrad. And what I hated that they always did is like, well, Latin America is this big thing, but we can use 3 examples and we can use those examples to explain all the other countries around. Let's take Mexico, let's take Chile, Argentina, and Colombia, and Cuba. And if you understand those, you can understand everything. It doesn't work like that, you know? So I don't know. I don't know what I'm saying. It's great, but let's have some caution.
Yeah.
You know?
And actually, the founder of Letras Latinas, Francisco Aragon, is Nicaragüense, right? So thinking about, he often thinks about his own heritage through Ruben Darío, thinking through the long history, the ancestry that is so important to him, but also it's so particular, but also can speak to a universal story. I often think that people often think that things that aren't large enough aren't universal, but I often tell my students, especially say Toni Morrison made this observation years ago, that A story can be universal. It doesn't have to be the majority.
Yeah.
It just takes the reader to empathize, or takes the reader to understand or see.
Yeah, I think a story can be universal if it's specific.
Mm-hmm.
And to go back to the conversation about Central American studies,
Mm-hmm.
Again, and departments are doing this, but just a reminder that let's do away with this idea of countries
Mm-hmm.
and nations,
Mm-hmm.
because it's just another idea
Mm-hmm.
that we were born into that gets replicated. And let's open it up to the discussion of the first peoples that
Mm-hmm.
were in what we now call the Central American Isthmus.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the discussion, in my opinion, should go towards.
Mm-hmm. So with the time we have left, I'm going to ask a couple of questions that are of a very different tack. So one of the questions I want to ask, I suppose I'll ask them for you now, to you now, but then let you sort of work through them at your own pace.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions is about mentors, not just specific writing mentors that you had, say, in an MFA program or as an undergraduate. Yes, those, and would you like to talk about them, but also people who you consider important to your writing, who mentored your writing in a big sense, in a cosmic sense. That's the first question. And the second one is actually about how you moved from Unaccompanied to SOLITO. And a very specific question about that is, do you consider SOLITO a translation of Unaccompanied across genres? Or do you think it's actually something else, a very different relationship? So those are the two questions I wanted to ask you. I can ask them again if you want at any point.
Let's start with the first one.
The mentors.
The last one.
Oh, okay.
Then I'll probably forget the other two.
Excellent. Yeah.
I wouldn't call it a translation.
Mm-hmm.
I'll call it an expansion.
Mm-hmm.
Moving from poetry to prose, it really felt freeing, because I had spent 10 years trying to do away, or like to cut and edit, in order for it to cohere.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the process is different of how the brain works.
Mm.
I was trying to condense this huge story into like little pearls, and showing the pearls to strangers, to teachers who were like, let's chisel it here, let's chisel it there, or you know what, that pearl sucks, throw it away, find a new one. Which after 10 years of doing that and like the way that I write, and I didn't understand it at the time, I'm writing about something very traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
And hearing that over and over and over again, it got to me. And it actually made me very unhappy. And the mistake that I did was that after a decade of going from, I'm just writing because I love this, into I'm writing to get published. And once it gets published, and really thinking that this first book is really me, and seeing that it's not being, you can't help the ego, and like, oh, it's not getting mentioned here. I'm not getting invitations by MFA programs, which have been the least to invite me to places. I'm not getting invitations by English departments, which also have been the least to invite me to places. So there's like all these little voices in your head that by the time that, I was trying to write a second book of poems, and I was just unhappy. I had gotten to a place where poetry had become a job. Poetry had become something that I didn't love doing anymore. And in that, I was like, well, fuck it. I'm going to try to just do this in prose. And the moment that I decided to do that, I was re-traumatizing myself, but it seemed, because by that point I already had a therapist who was kind of like guiding me and could kind of like protect other people from my anger and from my re-traumatizations, that it felt free and it felt purposeful, which is how poetry used to feel. But then it had stopped doing that for me. And so because of that, I see it as an expansion, not a translation. an expansion of places in my trauma that I desperately needed to uncover and to process. Because the constraints of trying to publish a book of poems, which by definition it has to be short and concise, wasn't allowing my trauma to expand and to go places that it needed to go. And that's just for me. And now I forgot the other two questions.
Oh, the other question was about mentors. So specific mentors in undergraduate and graduate programs, but also people who may be, in a more cosmic sense, were mentors for your writing.
Well, immediately, I wouldn't be a poet without having a poet guide me and provide literal books for me. And that happened in high school. Her name is Becky Faust. And, she's white. She had the means to just give me books, which for me, being undocumented and not having the best relationships with libraries. I'm not a writer who loves going to libraries. Because we didn't have one nearby of my community where I grew up. Now there is. And so just having access to books that I would never spend $30 on, $20 on, because this $20 I could eat or use to do something else. That was the beginning of my falling in love with books, which happened late. I hated books up until 17, 18, which, it's important for me to say. And after that, in college, I took Poetry for the People. A mentor who I didn't meet, but meant the world to me, was June Jordan. June Jordan's life, she's the daughter of immigrants. And she wrote a memoir that is a wonderful, very open memoir that reading it in undergrad, I was like, wow, you can be this open. You can tell your secrets. You can question your parents. I needed her memoir and her work. You can support Palestine, and you can be very upfront about it. We need more people like June Jordan. And you can fight against an administration by chaining yourself to Wheeler Hall at UC Berkeley because the administration doesn't want to give your students, a raise. That's what teachers should be doing. And so just I'm trying to lead my life in a way that June Jordan would be proud of. Another spiritual mentor would be Roque Dalton. Roque Dalton's like saying Dante or Shakespeare, Gabriela Mistral in my country. You can't write without acknowledging Roque Dalton. And again, he's most famous for saying the pen could only take you so far. You also need the sword and the bullet to get real change done. And meaning that these two individuals never thought or about the people that were their bosses, or never thought about the literary world. They thought of the people and what do the people need. And to me, being a writer, that's what it should be. What do we need right now? As for perpetuity, me wearing this, a lot of people have given me, hey, I have had things canceled because I'm pro-Palestine. And so, and a lot of writers, in my opinion, haven't done enough to just say, you know what, this is a genocide that we're going through. Well, the Palestinian people are going through. And so let's say something about that. Let's do something about that. And I just go back to, I always was mad when I was a history major, learning that not a lot of people knew or cared about what was happening in El Salvador. And so US taxpayers were paying $3 million a day to fund the killing of my people, of my family, and nobody did anything. And so I don't want to do that to the Palestinians. I don't want to do that to, the people in the Congo. I don't want to do that to what's happening in Sudan. I don't want to do that to all these people that need somebody that has the privilege of a voice to say something. And I wouldn't know that or be in that position if June Jordan and Roque Dalton weren't my mentors. Yeah. Now, the final layer to that would be Eduardo Corral. Eduardo Corral, I don't know how the fuck he found out that I got into NYU, but he gave me a call. I don't know how he got my number. I think I gave it to him through Facebook. Not that he's not a creep. He's a great person. And again, when I got to New York, and he led me and taught me how to write a cover letter, how to apply to these things, who to read. I remember going to St. Mark's bookstore that no longer exists, and we were just browsing. He's like, "Oh, you should read this, you should read that." And I was like, "Fuck, I'm not gonna be able to afford these." And then he just bought me 12 books. And that is very literal and very direct mentorship. And I owe Eduardo, I don't tell Eduardo enough, but I owe Eduardo a lot.
Yeah. One of the things I want to end on then is your own advocacy. And what you're saying now about everyone you mentioned, the mentors, there's a component of mentoring that isn't just giving you sort of spiritual or formal guidance in poetry, but also offering structural material support to enable you to pursue things. And one of the things that drove you to be one of the co-founders of UndocuPoets, that drove you, I think, reading the letter that you all wrote, I remember, to begin with, sort of announced your presence in the world as an organization, was that too many poetry prizes are restrictive according to citizenship. They do not enable people access that they need. They are purposely stopping certain people from becoming poets in very material ways. So could you speak a little bit about that? How that early advocacy within your career has also led to you speaking very forcefully about Palestine, for example. I see them as connected. I see the same way that you see the mentors and the writing and the examples they provided as things that prompted you to move in this direction as well. I do see actually your activism, your political organizing too, as being part of this bigger picture, connecting a sort of world through solidarity.
Well, I guess I'll offer a side note that will connect to this. I think for me, getting this very privileged position at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard, that's a mouthful. It's a fellowship that I think at that time I was one of the youngest. I was 27, 28 to get. So I was there with heads of departments at a lot of elite institutions. I was there with, the heads of the economics department at UPenn. I was there with the heads of the Black Studies department, the women's studies, blah, 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 blah. You can go through all of them. And being the youngest and seeing how these so-called experts in the fields have gotten so comfortable in their positions, in their unique field in the world, that in fact, they don't know a lot of what's happening outside of nuclear physics. Or, when I was there, they found a nebulae that's around the solar system that now it's called the Radcliffe Cloud. So people doing cool shit that are there, but those same people that know a lot of important work actually don't know anything about race. They don't know much about how to talk to another human being. And just seeing the blinders, I was like, these experts actually aren't that expert at being human. They're just expert at the one thing that they've dedicated their lives for, which we need them to. Great. But they're not, they don't know what inequality is. They don't know what racism is. They don't know that how you're talking to me is a fucking microaggression. And so I, along with, at that time, it was the most diverse cohort. I think there was 30 people. No, there was 50 people. There were 8 of us. Most diverse cohort ever. And I remember for my presentation, poetry, not the ones who did show up because they have to. I was just like, what's going on? Like, why are you talking to some of us like that? Blah, 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 blah. And so what I learned is that people need reminders not to get comfortable in academia. We're just talking about academia. Remember why you entered academia. Remember that academia is not only for you, but is to have other people eventually be let in the same room that you're at. Stop just thinking about how rich you're gonna get and how big your 401k is getting. Remember who you were. And especially for people who don't come from money, it is difficult to remember that. Because then you're like, oh, I need to take care of my family first, etc. But what I'm saying is that I knew from undocupoets and like speaking out that a lot of these experts, a lot of the people didn't even know that was a sentence that they had in their requirements. And they felt really bad that sentence was there. And they quickly moved it. There are other people like the Walt Whitman Prize and the Academy of American Poets at that time who were very, they stuck their ways into it. It's the American Poetry Prize. And we're like, what does American mean? Define American, like Jose Antonio Vargas, another activist who taught this, and they couldn't. And then eventually Alberto Rios comes out with this statement of like, oh no, we're opening it up. And now people in 2024 have forgotten how, I don't know, like stuck in their heels, I don't know the expression, they were. And so, keeping receipts, keeping people accountable, it is something that we need to do. I am a free agent. I'm not part of academia, and I'm holding out as long as I can because I know I have friends who are in academia, whose academic grants come from funding the Israeli state. And so they can't say anything because they will get fired. And that is the state of the situation in the United States. And I can wear this keffiyeh. I can say the things that I can because I am a free agent. Somehow I have rigged the system. I don't know if I would be as vocal if I knew that I would be fired the next day. I don't know. I'm not that cool, for sure. But yeah.
Well, thank you so much for making the time to do this. This is the end of the interview with the Oral History Project by Letras Latinas. Thank you, Javier Zamora.
Thank you.
And yeah.
Thank you.